All right. Hey there, everyone. Mr. Lewis here. I really appreciate you tuning in today to take in a little bit of new content in AP Micro on your e-learning day. I'm going to try to keep this rather brief, but I would like to go through one new section of Unit 4, Imperfect Competition, and that section is called Price Discrimination. Now, I'm not actually going to get into either of our final two market structures. We'll do that in section 4.4 and 4.5. Price discrimination refers to a behavior that we sometimes see from monopolies. So let's dive into it. This behavior is essentially charging different consumers different prices. What we've learned in the past is that each consumer has a certain willingness to pay, a maximum that they are willing to pay for a certain good, right? And what we've learned in this unit is that a monopolist is a price setter. That's different from what we've seen in the past in a perfectly competitive market. Under perfectly competitive conditions, we still talked about willingness to pay and how each customer along the demand curve here has a certain willingness to pay, some higher, some lower. But there was one equilibrium price. Because all of the producers in perfect competition are price takers and not price setters, they were charging one consistent equilibrium price. So all of these consumers who were willing to pay more than or equal to the equilibrium price were going to participate in the market. None of these consumers would. On the other hand, all of the producers who had a willingness to accept below or equal to the equilibrium price, they participated in the market, and these producers up here did not. So there was consumer surplus and there was producer surplus. And even when we learned about monopolies in section 4.2, we saw that when they're maximizing profit, producing where MR equals MC, it is going to cause deadweight loss because it's a lower quantity than the socially optimal or competitive equilibrium quantity, but there was still consumer surplus up here, right? There was still a little bit of consumer surplus, even with the monopolistic market. There's this other point I'd like to point out. This blue equilibrium here is what we call the break-even point. This is where the ATC curve hits the demand curve. So in other words, at that point, price would be equal to ATC, resulting in break-even profits, or zero, or normal profits. Now, let's look at how this graph changes with price discrimination. The price for each customer is going to be set equal to their willingness to pay, which, if you recall, is determined by marginal private benefit, the personal benefit that you experience from the consumption of a good determines the maximum amount you are willing to pay for that good. Therefore, if price is equal to willingness to pay for each individual customer, consumer surplus in the market is going to be zero. What the monopolist is essentially doing is trying to gobble up all of that extra consumer surplus that they can take and turn into profit for themselves. So the monopolist is actually going to produce all the way down to the point where price is equal to marginal cost. And ironically, this actually ends up at the allocatively efficient quantity. Now, consumer surplus is still zero. The monopolist is the one benefiting from all of this, but they actually end up producing a greater output that is equal to the allocatively efficient output. So, let's take a look at this on the graph. What these arrows are pointing out, first of all, is that the point where MC hits the demand curve is our socially optimal point, and it's where the perfect price discriminating monopolist is going to end up producing. I'm going to show you that in a moment. This other arrow down here is pointing out that our demand curve is essentially becoming our marginal revenue curve. Here's why. We're going to start at the top of this demand curve as the monopolist and charge this consumer exactly what they're willing to pay. Then we're going to do the same thing for each additional customer all the way down this demand curve. We don't have to charge just one price. So each additional customer, we're charging them what they're willing to pay, first of all, and whatever price they pay, that is the added revenue for us, or in other words, the marginal revenue. So we're going to stop where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So not only is that the socially optimal quantity, in this case, under perfect price discrimination, it's also the profit maximizing quantity for this particular monopolist. So all of this is going to end up being revenue. Instead of some of this going to the consumer as consumer surplus, now the monopolist has sort of regained all of that consumer surplus and turned it into added revenue, which is going to turn into added profit. So, no practice today. That's it for section 4.3. We'll get a little bit of practice with this after we finish section 4.4 and kind of throw the two together. And you'll see that the graph for monopolistic competition is actually very similar to the graph that we've been looking at in section 4.2 and 4.3. So that'll be a relief. We'll practice both of them together, but nothing for today. I really appreciate you watching this video lecture and taking the time to learn a little bit of new content today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again, and I'll see you tomorrow.